When the MP for Southend West, David Amos, was brutally stabbed to death at a constituency surgery by the son of Somalian refugees, you would have thought that the problems caused by mass immigration and the welcoming of so-called refugees into Britain would have been clear to all. This was another high-profile case of a second-generation migrant not becoming more British, but in fact quite the opposite. This case echoed the 2017 case of Salman Ramadan Abadi, the Manchester Arena bomber who killed 22 people after an Ariana Grande concert. So when politicians from both parties met in Westminster for the first time after David Amos's death, you might have thought that they would have discussed immigration, debated the effects of demographic change, or talked of the threat that so-called refugees pose to the British people. Well, you would be wrong. Members of Parliament didn't discuss any of those things. Instead, they spent the afternoon talking about ways to prevent the indigenous people from expressing their opinions on murders like this by further clamping down on internet rights and freedom of speech. That's right, the real problem at hand wasn't Ali Harbi Ali, the man of Somalian descent that had literally just butchered an MP. The problem was the fact that David Amos's murder might get white people talking about immigration and demographic change and the threat they pose to the indigenous people of these islands. But in the wake of David Amos's murder, another pressing question has been posed. Why was Ali Harbi Ali free to roam the streets of Britain? And yes, I know the obvious answer to that question is that the open-door immigration policy, favoured by both Labour and the Conservatives, let his family in. But there is another, possibly more interesting answer to this question. And the other answer to the question revolves around the government's Prevent strategy, and the fact that it has totally failed. Prevent is the government's counter-terrorism body that is meant to identify and de-radicalise people that pose a terrorist threat. And guess what? Ali Harbi Ali was previously referred to the Prevent programme, but was deemed of no real threat and was never formally investigated by MI5. Maybe that was due to his black Muslim privilege. Or maybe it was due to the fact that Prevent isn't really interested in stopping Islamic terrorism. Instead, Prevent chooses to spend a disproportionate amount of their time harassing nationalists for reading books and putting up stickers. And that claim isn't just right-wing rhetoric. That's actually what Prevent have been doing. In recent years, Prevent have put 43% of their resources into tackling so-called far-right extremism, compared to just 30% of their resources, which goes toward tackling Islamic extremism. So let's look at some of the facts that highlight just how ridiculous Prevent's resource allocation actually is. Earlier this year, I produced a video called Exposing the Lies About Right-Wing Terrorism. It's linked in the description below. In that video, I stated that since 1970, there have been 430 deaths from terrorism in Great Britain. Of those deaths, 1.39% were caused by right-wing extremists, and 84.88% of those deaths were caused by Islamic extremists. When looking at the deaths from terrorism in Great Britain since the year 2000, 95 people have died in terrorist acts. Of those 95 deaths, 3.16% were killed by right-wing extremists, and 96.84% were killed by Muslim extremists. Thanks to the actions of Ali Harbi Ali, those figures are now out of date, and they are even further weighted toward Islamic extremism. Yet despite nigh on 97% of deaths from terrorism being caused by Islamic extremists, Prevent is putting more effort into monitoring the so-called far right. But those are facts that I am presenting, which will of course be instantly dismissed by some. So let's look at some other statistics on terrorism. Figures from the 31st of March this year show that there were 157 individuals in prison classed as Islamic extremists, compared to just 44 categorised as extreme right-wing. That's more than 3.5 times as many Islamic extremists than right-wing extremists. On the same date, 98 of the 215 prisoners in custody for terrorism offences define themselves as Asian or Asian British. 68 classed themselves as white, and 18 identified as black or black British. In percentage terms, that means 46% of prisoners serving time for terror offences are Asian, 32% are white, and 8% are black. In terms of religious affiliation, 73% of prisoners in custody for terrorism-related offences declared themselves as Muslim, compared to just 12% who identified as Christian. These figures come from Terrorism in Great Britain, The Statistics, a study published by the House of Commons Library earlier this month. It's linked in the description below. So by any metric, it is clear that Muslims pose a greater terror threat to Britain than any other group. The fact is, when looking at ethnic and religious groups, Asians and Muslims are massively overrepresented when it comes to convictions for terror offences. Conversely, white people and Christians are massively underrepresented. So why then a Prevent letting killers like Ali Harbi Ali walk free, whilst committing so much time to knocking on the doors of nationalists over YouTube comments and tweets? Prevent is now so concerned with balancing the books and attempting to prove that Muslims and those of immigrant descent are not overrepresented when it comes to terror offences, that they are ignoring actual murderers so they can instead divide their time between chasing down young nationalists who put up stickers and issuing press releases about the growing threat of far-right terrorism. Further to this, the politicians are so committed to their multicultural project that every time a genuine terrorist attack occurs, they reveal the fact that they are more concerned about people talking about their failed policies than they are about the problem of terrorism itself. What's more, this mentality is shared by the government's anti-terrorism strategy Prevent, which would clearly rather spend its time and resources attempting to prevent people from legally speaking about the threat of Islam, demographic change, and mass immigration, than using those same resources in order to prevent actual terrorism. Terrorism, which is of course overwhelmingly Islamic. The only question that remains is how many more indigenous people must be sacrificed in silence on the altar of multiculturalism before this entire dishonest and genocidal charade finally comes to an end.